So this is Allison Hartsoe, and this is a presentation that I did at the DAA, the Digital Analytics Association up in Seattle. Unfortunately, they didn't record like they have in the past because they have these fantastic facilities up at Microsoft. So I thought, hey, I'll just record this and share it with the folks that maybe missed the presentation. What I like so much about this presentation is that it wasn't just about measurement, but it was actually also about women in analytics. So, as the Women in Analytics speaker, I started with a discussion about women's authority. And of course, we had to go to the recent impeachment hearings to at least get a sense of what female authority sounds like. And I had this article that I pulled up from Monica Hess at the Washington Post, and she talks about what women's authority sounds like. She gave these two examples, which I played at the DAA event. If you are interested in hearing them, I think I did Marie at about 2 minutes. 219 and Fiona at 135. Those are the markers where I think they have incredibly compelling stories. Now, one of the points that the author of this article made was that the first man to testify in the impeachment hearings was the Ukraine ambassador, the acting Ukraine ambassador, William Taylor. And he sounded like this very rich, baritone, mellow, oaky voice that frankly sounded like Walter Cronkite, who, if you are of the right age, you will know that he was the most trusted man on TV. He was a TV journalist, a newscaster. And so, similarly, we don't really have a reference for what female authority sounds like. So, my point here was really to play a couple clips of what these women sound like and why they sound so authoritative, and then hopefully to give a sense of my own authoritative sound, which I have been cultivating through the podcast that I run, the Customer Equity Accelerator. We've now had over 100 episodes, and this is a program that talks heavily about um, customer equity as it relates to companies understanding what their customers want. And I also wanted to point out at the beginning of the presentation that, hey, I've actually done a lot of work in this space. I've worked with about 3 dozen different Fortune 500 companies, and I've been featured in MIT Technology Review twice last year, through a conference with Wharton on customer-centricity that was sponsored by Google and Salesforce. So, hey, maybe this person knows what the heck they're talking about. So then I thought I'd share a little bit of my rules for women in analytics. And it basically comes down to don't be a dumbass, be a badass. Which I personally know I was a dumbass. And I wanted to reach out to the women in the audience and say, hey, there are lots of things that happen. There's lots of gray areas where maybe you're not sure if someone has your best interests in mind. Maybe you're not sure if it's a dinner date or if it's a business conversation over cocktails. It can be really hard to know that. So, my recommendation to the women in the room was to learn to read the nonverbals. We had a little fun because when people's feet point toward each other, it's a sign that that person is attracted to the next person. So I said, hey, at cocktail hour, pay attention to the feet. And that became something kind of fun afterwards. So nonverbals have actually helped me quite a lot when I thought somebody had my best interests in mind and really they were illustrating hostile behavior or behavior that indicated that they were clearly lying. Now, that's not something that you can pick up just by, hey, somebody touched their nose. Maybe their nose was itchy. It's more complicated than that. I won't summarize it here, but there's lots of great TED Talks and other presentations out there. Conversely, when we think about being a badass, my example here was really around Obama's cabinet. Um, the idea is that no one really succeeds alone. We are all part of a larger ecosystem, and the women that were on Obama's cabinet also felt this, and they were noticing that when they gave their ideas, that they weren't necessarily getting the traction that they thought they should get. So they put an ingenious plan together and they started to echo each other. So they would say, "Oh, I really think Mary's idea has a lot of credibility. I think we should try that. And in fact, I think Emily made a really great suggestion over here." And that concept of echoing actually got their ideas to take hold better and have more traction. Now, I have seen this myself in organizations where uh, the senior management team meets, and I am maybe one of two women in the room. And it is so helpful and so powerful when someone else will pick up and echo that idea. And it doesn't necessarily have to be another woman, but anyone that you want to lift up and promote at the table. This technique of echoing their ideas is actually a very strong one. So that was my introduction about don't be a dumbass, be a badass, and try not to live in that land in between where you're really not one or the other. You're just kind of average. Go for it. Be a badass. So with that in mind, we then shifted gears and went back over to the topic of measurement, which is uh, which is this concept of um, of measuring the distance between furniture. And the key point here is, what do these measurements tell you? If I put my dresser at a certain distance from the bed, will it mean that I have more sex with my husband? Or if I have my slipper rest just the right distance from the nightstand, will that actually mean that my kids won't interrupt me at night? Because those are the only things that I really care about. And the bottom line here is that metrics generate a lot of noise and they don't necessarily generate a lot of meaning. I call those junk food metrics. And junk food metrics are really rampant in the digital analytics space. So, whether you're talking about impressions or likes or any number of the just sheer, what would you call it, like digital transom, just the noise that's offset by any digital tool, the fact that you can measure something doesn't mean that it actually has any meaning whatsoever. And I particularly hate aggregates, such as all page views or visits or visitors, or another one that's classic is time on site. So the fact that somebody has a certain amount of time on site does not mean that they are indeed getting what they need. You can't tell the difference between whether they are lost and confused or whether they are actually getting what they need. And in a similar fashion, many companies take all those junk food metrics and they try to mold it into these frameworks. This is a framework that was designed to talk about reach, interaction, conversion, and engagement. And I find this to be such a heavy lift, such an exercise. It's like going to the grocery store and writing down all the ingredients on every package of food and then trying to mold it into what makes a really good recipe. It's just so much noise. So, frameworks don't really work when they are rolling up to things, in this case, like a channel that doesn't actually buy a product. So, my key takeaway is that when we look at data, we really have to use it to measure what we can about people and what they're trying to do, because it's people that buy our products, it's people that we're relating to, and it's people and their intents that we should be measuring in terms of how well we're helping or satisfying them. So that comes back into this idea of measurement is a function of the maturity of the organization. When you have very low maturity, Your measures are going to be tactical, but please don't roll them up into that framework like we just saw, where you just put a whole bunch of junk together. Really good segmentation, which we'll talk about in a minute, is all about use cases and shaping that behavior of who's coming and what they're trying to do. As an organization gets more mature, the measures get more strategic, and I'll show you some examples of what those strategic measurements look like and why those are great measurements. All of this is coming from a particular methodology that I have put together over the years. It is called the Customer-Centric Maturity Curve. I have a YouTube video on this. I have a series of podcasts on this, and it goes into great depth. But basically, the more you understand about people, the faster you should be able to make decisions. So, those are the two axes that we're plotting everything on. But companies don't just move up and to the right as one straight movement, they get stuck. And they get stuck oftentimes in the listening stage around just the sheer deluge of reports that's reflected from different things coming in from different tools, and the organization not really knowing how to sort it out or where meaning is. And that's oftentimes you'll hear people say, oh, I have all this data, but I don't have any insights. In the learning stage, the signature is a little bit different, because the goal here is to, once you have those signals from your customer base, you want to try to take action and learn more about them by tweaking things, moving things around, seeing if you can't resolve friction, get better results. So learning is really about that faster test and learn. How fast can I act on the information? But it also has a pullback, which I call the data lake of despair. And this is the idea that you slam all the information together. I land all the data from different data sources, but data in itself isn't inherently smart. Sometimes we have to augment it with better information. Data is just data, and the fact that I have it in one lake doesn't mean that I suddenly have a lot of fish. So the data lake of despair is another place where organizations realize, oh, I've got all this stuff, but I can't really get enough value out of it. Once they do get on top of it, they move into the leadership stage, and that's where innovations start to take off. And unfortunately, competitors start to copy them, but hopefully they've got enough traction and enough movement that they keep taking off. Here are some of the companies that are in different places along the curve. I do have stories behind each and every one of these companies, but basically the digital native companies move up this curve a bit faster than the traditional companies. And by digital native, I mean a company like a Stitch Fix or an Airbnb. They don't have a whole lot holding them back. And Amazon's included in here too, because Amazon has been very digitally driven, very data driven from the get go. Now, it's much harder for traditional companies like Electronic Arts and Banorte to move up the curve. So, for a traditional company, I have yet to see one make it in faster than 7 years. For a digitally native company, that can happen quite fast depending on the leadership and the people who are involved and the kind of data they're collecting. So, what should you measure? We're going to talk about this by zones because each zone has a different purpose. What you measure in zone 1 is different than what you measure in the follow on zones. So, measurement for a zone is divided into two areas: measurements that protect the quality of the data coming in and the progress that you've made, and measurements that accelerate what you want to do. Measurements that protect in the listening zone are really about staying on top of the data quality. And I've called out a couple tools here. Brian Clifton's Verified Data is a fantastic tool for Google Analytics. For campaigns, there's a tool that used to be called Tracking First. It's now called Claravine. It helps you audit the campaign information that's going out. You might think about this as just, oh, that's just data, but no, this is really important information, and this starts to be, one, how you trust the data, and two, where you can start to augment the data. And then I always like to mention the load speed tool Pingdom, because literally I have seen companies, one publisher, in fact, that was almost 7 seconds to load the site. And that's just ridiculous. Like, you cannot be that slow of a load. Google will just punish you up and down. I think we all know that today, but I like to include that in the measures that protect. Now, on the other hand, measures that accelerate are going to be custom ratios. The ratios I like to cite are things like look to book or look to buy, because this sounds like people who are trying to accomplish something. Net promoter score, even with all its problems, is still a good one to use because it's very easy to understand and it sounds like people. Another way you can accelerate measurement in the first zone is through use case segmentation. This is something that we do a lot of, and use case segmentation basically means to put together the information in such a way that you're creating mutually exclusive types of behavior and you're tracking what people are trying to do. So let's look at an example of that. In this case, use cases are around a non-converting, so it's a not transactional site. It's about a where to buy. So the key action is going to the where to buy page. And the application was around a redesign. So the use cases were defined as visit-based, mutually exclusive segments. And we captured at least 92% of the traffic or higher. So in a use case, you typically find that there are some irrelevant groups that either one, you can't highlight, or two, are creating a whole lot of noise in the data. We usually take those groups out first. So bouncers, people who come to the homepage, don't illustrate any kind of signature about what they're actually looking for and leave, are a perfect example of noise in the system. We've got to take those out. Secondarily, people who are flipping around the top of the product set but not actually diving in might be more collection browsers as opposed to people who are diving into the products and are looking at which we might call product browsers. And that we might and then another group that we might compare is inspiration seekers. Those are people who are going to a lookbook and they're trying to find new ideas like a Pinterest that you might have on your site. So these are all different types of behaviors that are separated. When you compare pre-redesign to post-redesign, in this case, all about how many people were getting into the where to buy, in this case, through a series of recommendations that have been made in a much, much longer PowerPoint deck, the redesign pulled another 66% from pre to post. That was the amount of increase in people that went to where to buy. And that was great. We want that kind of success story. So that's an example of how to think about the very first zone, which is the listen zone. Now we're going to move up to the learn zone, which is about increasing speed, increasing fluidity, and really taking the information that you trust about the customer and starting to use it. There's also a bit of a pivot in this stage, and that's where we sometimes change the grain from all traffic to specific customers and customer lifetime value calculations. So I'll talk a little bit about that here too. Zone 2, you might remember, has these kinds of companies. It talks about department alignment and C-level alignment. This is because there's a lot of organizational pressure happening when you start to do testing around the customer. The customer isn't just siloed to one group. They're not just siloed to one product. They spread across your organization. And so when you start to test for things that affect the customer and the success of the customer's journey and their experience, you're going to run head on into other departments, hence the importance of alignment. So what should you measure in zone 2? Well, everything from zone 1 still applies. But now, because you've set up some initial information that you're sending out to parts of the organization, the internal usage of those reports is actually quite interesting and quite powerful, in addition to the recommendation adoption rate, which is basically to say, if our organization makes a whole bunch of recommendations about what you should be using, what you should be doing, then we want our executives to understand, one, what those recommendations were, and two, If the ball got dropped, where did the ball get dropped? And that just simple tracking of what kinds of recommendations come out of the either the analysis organization or the customer organization, that's very powerful when it comes to the end of the year and people are saying, well, what did you do for me? You didn't really do anything for me. Then you can turn back and say, well, actually, we made 72 different recommendations, and here's what happened. So, very powerful way to start getting more adoption inside the organization. And in addition to that, you've got to, and this is not a deck about governance, but you've really got to understand the source of record for your data and the definitions of the data. Again, I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but governance becomes incredibly important for alignment because how you talk about channel and sales is maybe different than how you talk about channel and marketing, right? Now I need a dictionary. Measures that accelerate in this zone are all related to customer voice and survey and behavior. So I'm trying to understand more about people. How are they happy or unhappy? Can I get more qualitative information into the system? Can I start augmenting the data with more information? And that also gets back to segmentation. Am I seeing different segments, whether they're CLV segments or use cases, rising or falling? Am I seeing a rise in confused visits? Am I seeing a rise in high value customers? Or am I seeing that people are really churning from those higher value groups into lower value groups? And if so, what is causing that churn? Those are really interesting questions to chew on in the second zone that often lead to really great tests. And when it comes to tests, I oftentimes find that the number one thing that people are not accounting for is message resonance. I put out a test, there's a certain kind of way that I'm talking to the customer. I want to target a certain group and I want to encourage them to take a certain action. These pieces, whether it's the audience you're targeting, the action you want them to take, or the type of message that you're testing, those things should be captured in the campaign code. That is a great way to add detail into the data set in a very easy fashion. And it doesn't have to be human readable. You can use numeric codes because that is essentially public information that people can see. So think about how you're going to use that glue, those campaign codes, to take the tribal knowledge of what you're doing in campaigns and blend it into the data. A very powerful way to accelerate your system. And of course, we want cost because when we're looking at customer lifetime value, one of the first applications is to look at the customer acquisition cost. How much should I be paying to acquire customers from this particular area? Is that a good place to fish, or is that maybe not the best place to fish? Now, here's an example of what segmentation flow might look like. In this case, I've got it cut by CLV, I've got campaigns, I've got different types of campaigns and the ways that they are being used. The numeric codes actually track back into different types of messages, and I can see the kind of behavior for my highest value customers and how it's moving over marketing week depending on which campaign I want to look at or which group of campaigns. So in this case, it's a group of email campaigns, and I'm assessing how my platinum customers came in and either transacted or didn't transact according to the marketing week. And the thickness of the line also shows me how many people were coming in. So this is a Tableau example that you can use to explore the different data sets, use cases, customer lifetime value, campaign codes, and all those goodies thrown together to get more insights out of your data set. Now we're going to switch up to the third level, which is the leadership zone. And this is where data is being used as a competitive advantage. Companies that are up in this space, Domino's, Stitch Fix, Electronic Arts, who you can actually hear on the podcast. And not only are they innovating through the data, but they're also setting what becomes a new normal. So In classic change management, sometimes things change a little bit, and then one or two people who were heralding that change move on, and now the company goes back to the way it always did things. The big difference here is that leaders stick the landing. They move it up through innovation, and it becomes the new normal, the way the company does business. So in this case, what we measure is still protecting the downside on zone 1 and zone 2. Everything there still matters. But now I've got some real concerns about ethics because, not that I didn't have concerns before, but as I get better and better with data and as I'm moving people's behavior more toward what I want, I need to be careful that I'm not taking them over the line into something that is unethical. A great example here is Big Fish, which is a casino, online gambling site. And there's actually a really interesting case. I covered it on the podcast in August of last year, August of 2019. And in the court case, they talk about how these individual gamblers were targeted, and even when they asked and begged over and over again to please be removed, please delete my account, please, I don't want to gamble anymore, I have a problem, I can't stop. And they just ignored all of those requests and just continued to market to these people. That's what I mean by an ethical cross check. Now, you might think that that doesn't really apply to your business, but remember the classic example with Target and a health state of a woman who was not only underage but was also pregnant. These things can sneak up on you even if you're not a gambling site. So ethical cross checks become important. In addition, the organizations that are moving into the third zone are oftentimes running a lot of data models. And model security is something that's becoming kind of a thing. So if you're using deep learning to classify different types of images or different types of actions that are part of your deep learning scenario, then you also have to have a way to periodically check and make sure that hackers didn't insert a whole bunch of junk into your model so that you're suddenly classifying, I don't know, people as penguins or something incorrect. So model security is something that's just starting to get attention, and it does happen. It's something to defend against. On the upside, measures that accelerate are all about custom data augmentation. I think Stitch Fix does a great job with this because there's no way in hell you could move Stitch Fix over to Amazon because Amazon's not built to do that kind of data augmentation. Look at all the data collection that happens as somebody comes in and starts to set up their account. They're asking them a lot about their tastes and classifying their tastes. They're also doing that on the product side. That uniqueness in the data defends the organization from copycats. It's very difficult to do that. Spotify is another really good example of that. And in addition to that, the executive alignment around the customer becomes incredibly important. You cannot do customer lifetime value or even really good customer satisfaction, customer success, customer journey, whatever customer descriptor you want to call it. You can't do that without air cover from the CEO because the customer, again, goes across the organization. The customer does not just see themselves as interacting with one part of your organization, they see themselves as interacting with your brand. And so customer satisfaction becomes a really nice way to look across the brands and understand people's concerns, as well as customer value. I think the predictors, what drives your customer lifetime value, become an incredibly important way to align the executive team and also ensure that the company keeps attracting the right kind of customers and paying the right amounts for them and delivering the right products. Electronic Arts has a really great example on this. And if you think about it, these are the four key metrics that they use. Not only are these metrics pieces of customer lifetime value. So you're looking at customer retention, you're looking at profitability in terms of spend, and as well as how much do you have in the overall universe and how satisfied are the customers. But all of these metrics are trendable, and all of these metrics can be cut in a uniform way up and down the company, across platforms, geographies, franchises. So these are excellent trendable metrics. I think just a really great job for how to align the organization around key metrics that everybody can relate to and everyone can compare and understand. Another good example for why this makes sense was actually present in Slack's IPO. And I thought this chart really illustrated the point of why measurements should be around the customer and why we should be striving to satisfy not just the demands of Wall Street, but the demands of the customer, and that those two things can coincide. In this case, we're seeing that customers acquired as far back in 2015 are coming back and generating revenue again and again and again. And the same thing with the next year, the cohort from 2016 and 2017 and 2018. Basically, this is a chart of customer love. And yes, customers churn. Yes, people will disappear over time. But the fact is that they've got a very strong hook into who is their customer base and how much they come back, how much they love the company, they keep coming back, they keep buying, and that alone shows that in this case Slack has made a very strong connection between who's using the product and the fact that that product is right for those customers, and that they're constantly serving their needs by innovating and adding more. What a perfect example of the value that you can get from customer equity over time. So, if you would like a copy of this deck, you've probably seen this along the way in the presentation. You can text measure to 31996 and get a copy of it. You can also feel free to reach out to me directly or listen to the Customer Equity Accelerator podcast, where I explore a lot of these ideas with leaders in the space and other folks who are doing really interesting things. Thank you for listening and being part of this podcast. I hope to hear from you soon.